Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us. And I see from all over the globe this afternoon here in London. Masterpiece offers limitless opportunities for visitors to look and learn about works of art by engaging with our passionate and knowledgeable exhibitors and by handling objects in a relaxed but stimulating way, something we are, of course, all very much missing at the moment. Our Talks and Education programme plays an important role at Masterpiece, and we will now be continuing our programming throughout the coming year, to engage both an established and encouraging a new audience, eager to learn and discover new and stimulating ways of looking at works of art. Encountering Beauty Through the Material World is each month focusing our eyes and minds on a different material. February was devoted to marble, last month to wood, this of course to pigment, to be followed by bronze, ceramic and precious stones. This exploration spans cultures and times through a series of thoughtful and engaging podcasts, videos and panel discussions. And please do visit our website, masterpiecefair.com, to see the full extent of the programmes devoted to materials and to catch up on anything you may have missed. I very much hope also that you will join us again at the same time on May the 20th for our bronze panel discussion, Inspired by Nature, which will be chaired by Timothy Schroeder, and the panel will consist of Tobias Kapel, Rungwi Kingdon and Junko Mori. Today, we are focusing on pigment in our discussion, The Origins of Pigment. I would like to extend my deep thanks to our distinguished speakers and to Susan Moore, who will be moderating the discussion. As you all know, Susan is a renowned art market correspondent and additionally an associate editor of Apollo magazine. I will hand over to Susan, who will now introduce our speakers. But before I do so, I would like to say how delighted we are to be joined by Corrie Jackson, Senior Curator for our principal partner, the Royal Bank of Canada, with whom we celebrate 8 years of partnership and whose support, particularly over this last year, is so greatly appreciated. Susan, over to you.
Hello and welcome. It seems appropriate that we should gather today on Earth Day, a reminder that many of the materials that we should be talking about today are, of course, minerals mined from the earth, nature's paint box, as it were. We should be approaching this paint box of pigments from 3 very different perspectives, those of a creator, a conservator, and a curator. Kate Malone is a ceramic artist who has spent around a quarter of her professional life researching in and experimenting with coloured glazes, and the rest of it exploiting their unique properties. She has formed the largest crystalline glaze archive library in the UK. And Kate is the alchemist of our panel. We move from glaze to paint with Larry Keith, head of conservation at the National Gallery of Art in London. As a practicing conservator specializing in old master paintings, he harnesses conservation science to an understanding of traditional materials and techniques, and most importantly of all, perhaps, how these materials interact and change over time. And Corrie Jackson, Senior Curator of the Royal Bank of Canada, is dipping into the bank's collection for us to focus on the work of contemporary Canadian artists who have a specific interest in the materiality of pigment, and a conceptual approach to its use. So let's start with Kate. Welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to start. I've got 5 minutes to talk about my pigments, and I could talk about it for an hour. So I'm going to start without further ado with my first image. Hello, everybody out there around the world. Here we are. So, well, I make ceramics in 2 studios, and this is a photograph of my little London studio, which has this beautiful wall of shallow shelves, which is actually hidden behind a cinema screen a lot of the time to keep it dust free and to keep it out of our sort of eyes, because the studio is so small. But essentially, I work from a little studio in London and the largest studio now in Kent. And I work in 3 areas with ceramics. I work making decorative arts, and you can see a little pot at the front of the desk here. And I show those exclusively and have done for 25 years with Adrian Sassoon. And they can be little tiny pots like this one, or they can be giant pots that weigh half a ton, third of a ton. And I work using this palette, as you can see behind me. The second area that I work in that quite a few people don't really know that I do is working in public art sector. And that's making work for schools, hospitals, parks, libraries, and with architects. The most recent project was making the facade a black and a blue, black and a white facade for a large building on the corner of Savile Row and Conduit Street in Mayfair. And the third area, which feeds the two main areas, is this great big palette of color. And I think I probably have the largest glaze archive of stoneware crystalline glazes in the country. And it feeds my work both with interior designers and architects and my own personal work. And I work with a team of helpers. There's Erica and Marai working with me. Obviously, things have changed with COVID, but I have a mixed team of 9 helpers with different skills who make their own work in their own studios, but they normally work 2 or 3 days a week with me. And if we go to the next image, please, you can see that on the left is my personal glaze recipe book. And the colors on the spine that I'm tipping up with my hand indicate different base glazes. And I work, basically every single glaze has a recipe that you mix, a bit like making a cake. You weigh out all your minerals and ingredients, and you have basically an opaque glaze, or I do, on a shiny transparent glaze, and then I color it with minerals. And so every single recipe weighed out to 0.2 of a gram, and my scales are calibrated every month to check everything's okay. Are mixed and used on pots. And on the right hand side is a very rough, very funny sketch of one of the pots. It's a magma centerpiece for a table, and it has all the references to all the specific colors and mixing recipes that are in my recipe book on the left. Adrian Sassoon has got a copy of this book in his safe, and I have one in my studio, and London has one there. So it's a really valuable tome that I do hope to publish at some stage. But really, it is really chemistry. And if we go to the next image, please. You can see the minerals on the left, and I've popped a little glaze sample on the bucket. So on the left, I've got iron oxide and copper carbonate, nickel, vanadium, cobalt, and all sorts of minerals that I weigh out and mix. And it really is quite an extraordinary thing, because you have to visualize. So the image on the right, you can see this dark brown powder in the rich rusty color in the bucket. And when that mineral is added to glazes, you get a palette of honeys. And cobalt, which is dark blue when you've finished your piece, is pink when you're using it. So really, it's really involved in visualizing the colors. But essentially, this is really 30 years of research that I've been doing alongside my whole body of work. And if you look on Adrian's website, not only on the pieces for sale, but the pieces sold, he has a lovely section of pieces sold. You can scroll back through time and see the sort of research that I've done through time when I'm doing black and white and blues and browns and purples and things. Next image, please. And here's the finished thing. So here we have red iron oxide for honey, copper and cobalt for green and blue. And not only do the oxides color and pigment the glaze, they also make it run in a variable way. And you can see the blues streaking down this large pot here. This was one of a pair, mother and daughter. You can see the mother just in the background of the image. But essentially, my message really is about, you can never be original. Glazes really have always been done. You can see these colors on the Chinese horses of centuries ago. There's this great continuum of color that we use as potters, because it's a timeless thing. We're mining, as Susan said earlier, we're mining from the earth and digging these things up and using them. And the variables are so great. It's your recipe, it's the clay you put it on, it's the kiln that you put it in, and the fire source that you use, and the temperatures that you go to. So it's a never-ending palette of joy. And I think that's my 5 minutes through, I think, isn't it?
Kate, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Amazed by the sort of ambition of such a part. And of course, Larry has a different sort of challenge, because he's working with pre-existing masterpieces. And I should think that is absolutely terrifying. So perhaps you can talk us through the challenges of those and your approach and interest in pigment in that context.
Thank you very much, Susan, and hello, everyone. Well, I have to say, I actually hesitated about being part of this thing because the study of artist pigments, you know, their history, identification, their physical properties is not my specialist subject. And it's one where I have colleagues at the National Gallery who are world-class experts. And it's a fascinating history that ties to the history of technology and all kinds of really interesting offshoots. You could fill many hours just talking about that, especially in the hands of people who know much more about it than I do. But in the end, I thought it would be useful to speak to you today because as a modern paintings conservator, I think, you know, it's the way we understand and use pigments is kind of interesting because we work in a kind of weird interface between understanding how pigments were used, how those materials have changed, and then how we use similar but not always identical materials to simulate or replicate the effects that we understand from old master painting. So, you know, we start off from a position of being consumers really of our colleagues' scientific expertise. And some of it's pretty straightforward about identifying overpaint from identifying pigments because there's a known history of many pigments. So, you know, famously Prussian blue invented in the early 18th century is not, you know, legitimately found on a Renaissance painting, et cetera, et cetera. And there are all sorts of examples of that. And I mean, we can establish dating parameters and things like that, but that's more my scientific colleagues' expertise. But if I pull back a little, I think it's consumers of that fact, and then thinking about understanding artists' methods, especially how when we understand how artists use pigments, it helps us to read the paintings as they are now, and that, you know, can guide really fundamental aspects of how we clean and retouch works. And I think understanding the painting is an obvious, you know, it's the essential departure point for the treatment. You know, how has it come to look the way it does? How different is that from how it might have looked before, and what sort of changes might be achieved through our treatment? And so, you know, most old master paintings have undergone substantive changes. You know, sometimes it's through treatment history, and sometimes it's just irreversible chemical aging. So the first image you see here of Velasquez's Immaculate Conception from around 1618, you can see some really interesting examples. These images on the right are from her dress, her tunic. When you see in the sort of in the hollows or in some of the interstices of the paint texture, you see strong lines of brighter red color. And that's what remains, I think, of a very strongly tinted translucent glaze applied over a lighter underlayer. So her dress would have been very strongly colored in a way that's largely gone now. That's mostly faded. You see these remains of red where it was much more thickly applied. And so that's not anything we can do anything about, but understanding that and looking at the picture, and it changes lots of things about, you know, how you read his intention of balancing the blue mantle with the red dress, and so on and so forth. And we're doing that constantly. It's a kind of ground zero of understanding what we're dealing with when we look at old master paintings. We move to the next image, please. You can see, and you know, it's quite fun to think about that a bit more as we look at old master paintings, and we don't try to reverse those changes. We can't, we accept those really, but it's fun to play. And my scientific colleagues have done this famously with the Rokeby Venus, where again, a red pigment, a red lake, a translucent glaze is both used directly on the curtain, and it's a constituent. It's one of the pigments used on the bed sheet with black and white, and that would have made a rather beautiful deep purple, and that red has faded. And so they've done a little bit of scientific image, you know, manipulation, just to give you an idea of what kind of colors might have been on that picture. She would be lying on a rather rich purple color with a strongly colored red background. And already that changes what we think about Velasquez and, you know, his love of Venetian painting and his references to that. In a work like this, it becomes much more Venetianizing. It also links more strongly to works we know by him that are better preserved. So again, that's another aspect where, again, led by my colleagues in scientific, we understand a great deal more about paintings and how they're made. But I think understanding that is just one phase. When we start to think about cleaning and what we can do through the agency of our treatments, then I think that's part of it. There's lots of changes of pigments, and interactions of pigments in media where we have darkening or blanching or fading. And for the most part, we really can't do much about that. We have to accept that, but it's key to the understanding and thinking about relationships and how they exist now in the picture as we clean. But in other aspects, when we come down to actually retouching, there's another aspect where we're thinking about pigments and their properties very much in the same way as the painters did in many respects, because our default setting in doing retouchings, they're intended to be deceptive. That is, you're not meant to be able to see them and tell where they stop and start. It's a casual viewer in the gallery, although you can see them with ultraviolet light and all the rest of it. They're easily removable, they're on top of the varnish, etc. If we move to the next slide, please, you can see therefore that we use sometimes identical pigments if they're stable, like an iron oxide and ochre is much the same as was used before. Sometimes we use equivalent pigments with reversible retouchings. We use equivalent colors, but what we try to do in our retouchings, though, in some, is to copy the layer structure, and that is the kind of optics, the optical architecture, which is really at the heart of why these paintings look the way they do. So if you move in the next slide, you can see here are just some retouching paints painted out in different thicknesses on light grounds and dark grounds, and you can see how the darker underlayers can shift the tint. They can also affect transparency and translucency. So these things, I think when we do our retouchings, when we copy these layer structures, we exploit the inherent qualities of the pigments we use, things like tinting strength and refractive index, which is how transparent they are compared to the medium, the way they behave in mixtures with other pigments, all that kind of stuff. We do that more or less the same way as was done to achieve the effect of the original. And the really crude example I drag out, forgive me if you've heard me say it before, but you can make, everyone knows you can make green by mixing blue and yellow together, but you can also make green with a transparent yellow over an opaque blue. And therefore that's a very basic example, but if you're trying to retouch a damage on a painting that was achieved with one way and you do that with a different buildup, it won't work. You have to understand how that layout was, how layout was a buildup was achieved. You have to understand the ground colors and the interaction. And I think that gets to the heart of understanding the properties of the pigments and how they were so brilliantly exploited by old master paintings. And that understanding of transparency and opacity is really at the heart of what we do. And it's the heart of understanding it. And also it unlocks a whole kind of new appreciation of the skill and expertise of the artists who made them. And I just have one last slide, which is slightly embarrassing because it shows that some people work more neatly than others. I'm in the second category of not as neatly as it could be, but here's a retouching palette in the process of being used for restoration. So that's all I wanted to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. That was really interesting too. And now we move up from the very old to the very new. And so I'm now going to introduce Corrie to show us some of the works of art in her collection.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Susan. And taking off from what Larry was saying about the importance of understanding an artist's methods to help us understand a work, I think that really does hold true when it comes to contemporary work and how we think about an artist's process and their intents for making as we find ourselves as an audience member looking in. I wanted to include this quote by Christina Mackie, the artist that's in the image to the left. Christina is one of the artists who we've recently installed in our RBC Bishopsgate offices in London. It's a new installation of about 30 works that we've installed remotely, but I have seen these pieces in person and really appreciated them for their pigment and color and her intents of how she kind of explores surface in that way. And she says, refining color, making color, and having it as a thing you could use, but have been one of our earliest technologies. Because it was precious, it must have been used for magical purposes. It was an agent of transformation. And I think that just goes back to kind of what my colleagues were saying earlier on of this role of pigment being this tool for transformation that has something a little bit magical to it. I want to go to the next slide. This is another installation of Christina's work, this one at the Tate, that kind of shows the importance of pigment and how she thinks about her installations and her surfaces. This is very different from the two-dimensional paintings in the collection, but much more tied to her thoughts on color. In this, you can see these large trays of kind of raw pigment in medium, with these giant silk nets that hang down from the ceiling and slowly absorb the pigment over time, kind of leaving the crystals and the remnants of that original pigment at the bottom of the tray. And then at the bottom left, you also see some of the rocks and materials that would have been ground down to create those original pigments that you might otherwise see in some of the cases or bottles that become used as tools to mix with mediums. So in terms of a contemporary artist who has an interest in pigment, I think Christina has a really interesting process of exploration and material, and really allows the viewer to think about the role of color and pigment as a tool and a part of her palette, a set of tools. If you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. This is another artist, Corrie Sworn. Corrie is a Canadian artist that currently works out of Glasgow, and she works with natural materials and natural pigments in a really interesting way. Again, this is some of the work from our London offices, and on the left you see an image of a garden, and that's one of the herbatoriums in Edinburgh or Glasgow, where she does a lot of her source work when she documents these gardens and spaces and thinks about the role of the materials in these gardens as also tools for creating pigment. So after she spends time in these spaces, she then looks at the materials that are the organic materials that she captures in the photographs and actually uses them to dye these beautiful silk monochrome canvases that you see on the right-hand side. In this case, she worked with madder, but then mixing that pigment with other kind of complementary elements, copper, iron, even lemon, to create different reactions. And these reactions between the different pigment sources create these colors that become dyed onto the silk. And the silk being a really beautiful material for holding that pigment, absorbing light and kind of refracting it back onto the surface. So a really interesting conceptual practice where she thinks about our relationship to space and place, and then that place's relationship to color and form, and how can you move this space captured in an image into whatever gallery, museum, office space where these works then become hung. If you want to go to the next slide. Just one more artist to kind of introduce that I think also has a really wonderful relationship to pigment and color in the collection is Josh Thorpe. And I think you can see on the left-hand side, these are a series of works that we have in the collection that are actually quite detailed explorations of color and pigment, some of them done with pastel and quite playfully. If you go to the next slide, there's a bit of a close-up, and the artist actually takes elements of these pigments and plays with them with his hands, and you see kind of that direct interaction and touch. It's a bit of a longer quote that I wanted to include, but in it, the artist is describing his relationship of seeing raw pigments, kind of almost like what you showed Larry, kind of sitting on that shelf. And the inspiration for part of these works is see them and really just wanting to play. The role of pigment is having some kind of spark of an imagination and making us want to explore, to play with the material, to see the potential within what those pigments offer. So this is kind of a very high level summary of some of the artists in the collection who have a really, I think, thoughtful relationship to pigment that's really driven by them wanting to be informing their audience about an experience through pigment and how they present it. But I'm looking forward to talking more about, I think, also the relationship of contemporary arts work to the historical and the historical role of pigment as well, perhaps in the discussion. But for so many contemporary artists, there is so many options when it comes to what pigment they can use, what colors they can use, but each pigment has its own kind of history that they're also drawing from and proposing to the viewer along the way. So I think with that, I think that's my time, but I will looking forward to having the larger conversation with the group.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really interested in all these different interactions and these ideas of transformation that you have with when you're looking at all these materials and what color can do to things, and this relationship between science and chance. And I wanted to ask Kate about that, actually, because you're talking, you know, about the recipes and it's like a scientific process, but then you also work with chance, and presumably you have to have, you know, you run with it, you have an idea of what you want, but then it sort of takes over. There's a sort of transformation, and you either fight it or go with it. So perhaps you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A really great comment, Sue, because when I started out at college, I tried to glaze everything perfectly without runs. And when you said run with it, you know, glaze melts and it runs like when you used to paint gloss paint on doors and you used to try and not get those curtains. And so I decided to go with it. And then to sort of emphasize that, I chose glazes that are so runny. And when you say an element of chance, I call it the kiln gods, because you shut the door on the kiln. On my huge kiln, it's shut for 3 days, and it takes a day to heat up and 2 days to cool. And it's during the cooling, I didn't touch on the fact that I grow crystals in my glaze, which is also a pigmentation in itself. And I'd love to talk more about that, but we don't have time. It would be too self-indulgent. But really, when I make a pot, I have to visualize. And as you've seen, the minerals are all so different to that, when it melts and it transforms in the kiln. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's not what I visualized. And it's a matter of looking at how that's responded and trying to move forward, freeze that in my mind, hold it, observe, and move again. But always it's a constant surprise. And when the glazes, I suppose what I was thinking, what separates me out from the other speakers is that I'm working on the way color relates to form, and we're talking 3 dimensions. So when I put a blue glaze at the top of a form, or a green glaze, let's say, at the top of a pineapple, I know where it's going to travel, and that really enhances the pigment rivers, if you like lava coming out of a volcano. They emphasize the form and they unite form and surface. And that's what I'm really interested in, not just the sort of fixed color that I put in place, because it all runs and actually drips like candle wax off the bottom of my pots into trays that's collected, and then they're thrown away. Actually, they're like lakes of color glaze, very interesting in themselves. A lot of people love them and take them home and put those trays on the wall. But it's that serendipity and that just giving in. It's a bit like life, isn't it? You know, you hope it's going to go one way, but it hardly ever does. And you just have to really go with it and respond and make decisions about it. Yeah, it's fascinating.
But there's a sort of experiments that work, and those that don't. And I was thinking in terms of Larry having to deal with horrors of artists like Reynolds, who decide, oh, let's use bitumen. And then, you know, what happens over the course of the centuries is disastrous. And I mean, it's interesting that Larry said that they wouldn't, I mean, how do you deal with something like that? I can understand that you don't repaint the colors red or something very central, but when everything is completely black and sunken, what do you do?
Well, I think you recognize the limits of what you can do, informed by finding out as much as you can. And I think the thing that we didn't really have time to talk about was those interactions of pigment and paint media. The other thing that, you know, that can affect the chemistry of the pigments themselves. Again, that's getting into rather specialist territory, but understanding their properties in different media too, how transparent or opaque they are. But sometimes there are changes in paint, whether it's media or pigment derived or even support, that are just things you have to manage and you can't really reverse. And the best you can hope for is the complete understanding of what's happened and why, and then that informs your you know, relatively conservative, I would hope, approach to intervention.
Well, I think that's being conservative in that sense is a very good idea, and it's obviously not what Corrie's artists are really interested in doing. But do you have a sense that your artists are really interested in the in how artists of the past use pigment, Corrie?
I think so. I think that so much of an understanding of pigment, understanding of color comes from our own experience of art history. For an artist going into a museum or into a space and seeing how a color has been presented in the past is inherently going to inform how they might consider it now. And I think we have different emotional ties to different pigments and colors. Different forms will bring out different kind of responses. And I think that I can't speak for all artists, but even as a viewer, the more we see, the more we kind of understand what that response can be. And I think that there's an amazing history of that. And that research is so a part of a lot of the artists whose work I've talked to. And I think there's also something, Larry, you were talking about kind of the stability of a piece, and it's also the experimentation of an instability, maybe more like what Kate was speaking to, that's part of that research and experimentation as well. Just thinking about Christina's work, she's not interested in the stability of any one pigment, but rather kind of wants to see what happens as it changes over time. This is a site-specific installation, but also durational, where those surfaces are absorbing color over time. And it's not going to be a permanent work in the future. It just becomes this intent of an exploration of color, and then it goes away. So, I think that there's.
I'm sorry. I think it's quite
Go
interesting.
ahead, Larry.
We kind of sit as conservators, and we live a little bit more firmly allied to the world of craft and craft tradition, which was so fundamental to artist formation for a very long time. And I think the history of artists looking at older art has always had a lot of variation in the depth of their understanding. Obviously, I don't know, Leonardo would have known exactly how Verrocchio painted, but maybe Reynolds didn't quite get Rembrandt as well as he thought he did. And sometimes I think in more contemporary periods, there's an element of how much they actually want to know or very interested. There's a difference between being interested in the effect of things and the final finish, and how much we want to understand how it was made. And that's the thing where the manipulation of pigment, getting back to our subject, is fundamental, I think, to the distinction between the look of it and the replication of how it was done.
Well, and so many of these narratives of how that, what mediums were used, what proportions are so lost. So it might be that an artist has had time in front of a work, feels deeply inspired by it, but then the work of actually getting into the chemistry of it is almost impossible. And I think, Kate, it kind of speaks to the importance of things like what you're creating of these templates for the next generation of artists in the future as well. How are they going to be able to think about the glazing, to look at your work, but then also understand the whole process behind it? It's a really amazing legacy.
Yeah, I mean, when I was, one of the big inspirations of my work was Wheeldonware, which was seeing manganese running over a plate and down from into the gravy section of a bowl or something. And I thought, how does that happen and why does it happen? So, and of course, although there are similarities through time, obviously we're producing and using and mining different ingredients and colors and things that are chemically made, encapsulated colors these days. But essentially, yeah, it's just layering of time, and yet nothing's original, and yet it all is. And my recipe book, if somebody picked up my recipe and tried to mix it in America, labeled the same materials, they'd be slightly different. Manganese mined in Russia or India will behave, they give you different tones. And I'm sure Larry's, you must know that pigments come from different mines and different depths, and they change all the time. I try and buy as big an amount of cobalt. Cobalt's about £1,000 for a jar, a good jar, and iron is about 10 quid for a good jar, but I try and buy big amounts so that the research that I do has a constancy, but still that changes. I'm actually chasing, the last image that I showed was a pot that was made, I think, in 2000 and, well, I'm not sure when it was made, but it was a long time ago, and I can't get frits that give me that transparency anymore. I can't, because the frits are being made in China now, and they're less pure and they won't melt as clear with great transparency. The thing that struck me with things that Larry said was first of all, starting with a dark or a light ground, whether the artist did that. And I know painters do that, but I relate so strongly to that with red clay and white clay, for instance. The glazes behave so differently on those things, and the transparency and opacity of things. If I have very fine detail of a pot, of course I can't use an opaque glaze because it'll just cover it over like a bechamel sauce. I must use transparency. So there are areas of my work that I'm obliged to use different transparency and opacities and different levels of that, but I'm still chasing that transparency I got 30 years ago. So what
I think
a
there's something
job.
really interesting in that, in this moment, I feel like I always make the assumption that, all pigments, all colors are just kind of readily available in some way, if not, the original intent, there's some kind of a copy of it, and that's maybe diluted down, but artists might still be able to access. But when you look at the history of pigment, the rarity and the preciousness of certain colors over time would also inform how artists would use them in their work. And I think that's an interesting kind of thing for contemporary artists to consider as well. What colors, pigments do they prioritize? And then what are the histories of some of those pigments as well? Thinking about those bright blues, each of these pigments used to have a whole history of trade associated with it that kind of, I'm curious how you both think about that now, because I think in the contemporary, it gets diluted in an interesting way.
I mean, the classic example, of course, that everyone knows is the lapis lazuli coming, mostly from Afghanistan. But the point is not just, oh, well, that's really expensive, but in the same way that we look at gold and we think, we like gold, but our experience of looking at it is bound up in appreciation of its preciousness and value. And an educated viewer looking at a Renaissance painting would have exactly the same response to those blues, in a way that, for us, it's kind of intellectual. Oh, yes, it's in the contract, it's very expensive, but it doesn't kind of ooze luxuriousness and in the same way. I think it's an intellectual construct for us, and it wasn't for them. And I think that probably happened to varying extents with many colors, the experience of looking at them at different times.
I also love the fact that in these Renaissance contracts, it's quite clear that some of the patrons are so terrified that the artists will use sort of, cobalt, and so they actually even supply the lapis themselves. I mean, and I was just thinking about that. Of course, as you say, gold and silver is obvious, blue isn't. And I just wondered with Kate, do your patrons come to you and say it's got to be exactly this color, purple, and it's because this is, redolent or symbolic of something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got one collector who just doesn't like blue, and I don't, if I'm making a piece and I don't really think of her as she might choose to have it, but I don't know, it's fascinating. I mean, there are the associations as well of color. Red clay is a pauper's clay and porcelain is a rich man's clay. It's a bit different these days because you get, clay's a lot more available and less differential in it, although it is still very different in its price. It's not really restrictive. But I work with interior designers, and they'll come and they'll look at my palette of, I've got some blues here, actually. I'll just hold it up to the camera here. And so that's a reflection of different amounts of cobalt, and that's cobalt and iron. And really, I'll literally, there was one project where we said, okay, we're going to use that tile and that tile. And I'm looking at doing a facade in a villa in the south of France at the moment. And this is the tile that I have that we're working from. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of palette of color. I prefer to be very free with things. And obviously, when it comes to a commission, it's just best to be given a free hand. But yeah, I definitely enjoy the challenge of trying to match things and work with things. It's great.
Well, I'm just wondering whether it's time to allow our audience to ask some questions, and we can always, expand and chat more.
Yes, hello. So we've got quite a few questions. I think I'll start with a question about the quality of pigment over the centuries and whether the quality of the raw materials has changed as far as any of you have noticed or know.
Well, I think we can ask Larry to start that and Kate probably to finish it. So,
well, I think the quality has always been variable throughout history in terms of stability and light fastness, and that's been the case from the beginning. I guess the very cave paintings were probably all minerals and rather tended to be rather stable. But in terms of the classic historic painting, basically it's those more transparent colors, the ones that were the organic colors, are the ones that have always been less stable. And if I think, broadly speaking, looking at the history of paint manufacture, when new things are introduced, some of them are not so good as others. And I think that's certainly true with the explosion of industrial manufacture in 19th century tube colors and impressionist things. And, much has been written about massive color change in works of Van Gogh, for example. In the more modern times, I think it mostly depends about, what kind of money you'd like to spend. And, it's all very well understood now. You can look up the light fastness and there are indices to explain quite a lot of that. But with paint, in the Western tradition anyway, it's always good to underscore the fact that a lot of it has to do with the interface between the chemistry between the paint and the medium as well. And that's a fundamental aspect.
And presumably that sort of artisanal skill, you have to understand these things, you have to prepare your canvases or whatever properly and understand what you're doing.
It's helpful, yes. I mean, if you choose to do that, yeah, the more you know, yeah, of course. There's this whole question. I mean, there's not a right way or wrong way, but it's interesting to contemplate in more recent times how informed artists' choices are. How much they choose to be, and there's no right or wrong about it. But that has consequences for permanence and stability. That's for sure.
Well, I'm sure that's when we're being experimental. Kate, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I'm feeling rather smug here, actually, because permanence is not something that I have to deal with. I know my glazes are going to be as radiant if the pieces exist still in thousands of years, and it's encapsulated in these glasses that are held, and so it's a very different. There's no fading, absolutely no fading. I have people who say, if I put it in the window, is it going to fade? And it's just so great to say that it isn't.
Are the pigments less sort of intense, perhaps?
No, they don't change at all.
Before
that, the supply of the pigment. Well, yes. I mean, I use one particular ceramic supplier because I've had a talk with him, and he's told me he doesn't go to the cheapest cobalt or the cheapest iron he actually sticks with the same supplier. He's actually looking at sustainability as well of supply at the moment, because things are mined and the ethics of mining. And so, there are some suppliers who'll just go for the cheapest manganese on the market when they need to buy another ton of it that they'll supply to the potters of England. But there are other ones who, and they keep their prices higher, and they say they don't, they're going to keep that integrity because of various reasons, purity being one of them. Yeah.
Good. Laura, thank you.
So this one I think is for a bit of a debate between Corrie and Larry, possibly. Historically, there were more limitations on the range of pigments available to artists. Has the access to a greater number today made artists more experimental or less?
Ooh.
Well, I mean, I would say, when you have a reduced palette, whether you mean it metaphorically or literally, you think differently about how you achieve color and, what you can say with fewer notes, as it were. I don't know if that's better or worse or more. There's more choice available now. And I think it's interesting that you have to think about different chroma in the same way. You can get intense colors all across the palette in a way.
I think the experimentation maybe moves away from just the pigments into, why these pigments, what's the impact going to be of them? It becomes the focus of that experimentation shifts. Perhaps I think it's really unfair to say artists of one generation or moment in time are any less or more creative in their experimentation, because the tools always change, shift over time. It just becomes the artist's role to push whatever's in front of them as much as possible. And I think that's a consistent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do wonder sometimes that the kind of layering tendencies, in broad terms of old master paintings might be slightly, in some way, related to trying to extract as much range.
Oh, absolutely.
From fewer pigments. I mean, there's a whole argument. I mean, that kind of
Make the most of whatever pigment they have. Like the more, like that soft glazing over time to be able to stretch a pigment out is something that I don't see very much in contemporary work. But then there's also, I think, experimentation right now with what, the blackest black. How are we creating pigment? How is it used? Artists working with NASA to look at different pigmentation. So it's experimentation isn't consistent, which is part of the excitement of it all.
And we're not really talking about varnishes either and what they do for paints and whether artists choose to varnish or not and how that affects pigment. And I know we talked a lot about glazing, but the thing we're also not mentioning is that scumble, when you put, light colors over dark ones. Those who are old enough to remember people smoking, this classic cigarette smoke against a light wall is kind of black, and against a dark wall it's blue, and it's the same stuff. And that's exactly what we're kind of talking about in terms of manipulating paint over dark grounds. And you can really make the same pigment appear in very different colors depending on what's above and below. And I think that kind of tendency is probably born out of, in some way, exploited, had to be by having a less range of pigments readily available.
I think it's amazing how many parallels there are, of the things that you're both saying between, my scumble is rutile light. If I find, so I can make a pot, dry it, bisque fire it, glaze it, fire it. And if I don't like it, I can put, I use a very strong clay, I can put it back in 20 times, to the extent where everything's mingling and mixing, and it's completely predictable and unrepeatable. But at the same time, if something's too strong, I can put a wash of this rutile over it and again play with that. And I'm fascinated, Larry, with you unpicking things backwards, whereas as artists we build things forwards, and it's really, really fascinating as well. So many parallels that I had no idea about.
Laura.
That links to, there's been a couple of questions, Kate, about your training and how much chemistry training you had, or was it trial and error? And linked to that, a more specific question about one of your large blue pumpkins with a crystalline glaze over, and wanting to know a bit more about how you achieved that.
Well, the first question is, I did a BA for 3 years at Bristol Polytechnic. It was a technical college, and I used ready-made color that was in jars on a shelf. This is pigment that will take high temperatures that you put in a clear glaze or under a clear glaze. And when I started my Royal College of Art MA, which was a 3-year MA, I didn't know that copper gave you green or cobalt gave you blue. It hadn't been a concern. I was kind of interested in effect rather than cause. And so in the Royal College of Art, I set out myself just to find out about what does 1% copper do, 2% copper, 3%, and then the same with cobalt and the same with manganese, and then pushing across at lower temperatures. And then when I left the Royal College, I decided to go up. In fact, an architect asked me to make fish tank accessories for a tank in Japan, and it was warm saltwater fish. So I was forced to go up in temperature to make it less soluble, so I didn't poison all the koi carp. And then that was it, and it's just expanding this palette and playing and mixing, and again with the chance of it and not really understanding, but suck it and see. So I can't really, I have to admit, turn around and say to you that my basic glaze recipe without looking at my Bible. I tend to mix and see. I don't really know the actual chemistry behind it, but I just know what I'm doing, and I try and move forward with that. Probably a bit too fast, and it's just a matter of having a thirst for new effects and also the unknown. And the second question about the pumpkin with the crystals. So I don't want to take up too much time, but essentially I supersaturate solutions at high temperatures using zinc in my recipe, and I grow crystals on the surface of my pots in the same way as a diamond grows in the crust of under the earth, or an emerald, or a lump of coal. It's to do with heating and cooling and ingredients. And nickel oxide is the one glaze. I use 1.5% nickel oxides in a clear glaze, very high temperature running clear glaze. It's the one mineral that gives you electric blue crystals in a honey ground. All the other minerals give you blue crystals in a blue ground and green crystals in a green ground. You get different shape crystals, and tungsten and antimony start changing the crystal shapes. But essentially, it's that one nickel oxide glaze that is just so extraordinary, and you never know how big the crystals are going to grow, because they seed around little dusts, imperfections of dust, and they seed and grow like a real crystal does. But I could go on, as you can tell. I don't want to hog the nickel oxide glaze story.
Laura, let's have another question.
So when you consider the past through the lens of photography, beyond a certain date, the past becomes black and white. Pigment can be our only link to an understanding of a colourful past. Do the panel have any examples of artworks that have changed their perception of the past?
Who's going to jump in?
Well, I found many years ago, I think it was 1988, 89, there was a fantastic exhibition of Sienese painting at the Met, and among which were works by an artist relatively unknown to me in my callow youth, someone called Liberale da Verona, and they had some predella paintings from large altarpieces. So they were panel paintings, this sort of height, and figures, I don't know, 10, 12 inches high. And they'd also borrowed some, he was a painter like Lorenzo Monaco. He did big scale altarpieces, but he was very well known as a manuscript illuminator. And they had some very large format for manuscripts, peach sheets they'd borrowed by the same artist, with figures in more or less the same scale. And of course, the whole history of exposure and the medium and the lack of varnish and cleaning, the manuscripts were staggering in color relationships. The way there were juxtapositions of purpley reds and orange reds that seemed to clash, and yet they didn't, and blues and purples. And they're beautiful and so carefully worked out, and so very, very well preserved, because there's no varnishes to discolor. There's none of the stuff that happened. They weren't out exposed for 600 years. And thinking about them next to panel paintings with similar format was both revelatory and kind of depressing. But it was a little bit of a window, I think, on what things look like then, rather like when you hear of tiny snippets of color remaining on the walls of Romanesque churches, or an understanding of how much more color there was. It's true that we've lost a great deal, but there are these key things to look out for, those little bits of evidence, those few paintings that weren't exposed, that haven't changed. And they've kind of, to me, they're part of that musée imaginaire that we carry around, that allows you to kind of compensate when you see the great majority of things, alas.
Corrie, anything that you've
Yeah,
seen?
I think my mind initially went to maybe what Larry was speaking to around when you see something's original intent. And I think, the first realization that a lot of the classical sculpture I'd come to know used to be covered in pigment and color, and is no longer, what I'm seeing in the slide today or seen in person today. But I will say, recently, one of the artist's works who's really kind of made me rethink relationship to the past is a contemporary artist named Rajni Pereira. She does a lot of work that's looking at the figure in relation to the future. So her subject matter are individuals, figures. Sometimes it feels like portraiture, sometimes it's figures in a landscape. And she's interested in futurism. So it's kind of this post this moment, looking into, maybe even a post-apocalyptic moment, and who survives. And these figures often have elements of traditional clothing or dress from many different kind of cultural reference points, and it's the conflation of them into these figures. And so whenever I think about her work or look at her work, it makes me think so much about the past and these kind of histories that we know or don't know. And color is really important in her palettes, these traditional, or what become traditional colors from different geographies, kind of coming back to life in these future costumes.
Laura, let's have another question. I think we've got time for one or two, possibly just one.
So there's been a lot of questions about natural pigments and sustainability, and a few questions about whether contemporary artists are moving back towards more natural techniques and use of pigments.
I think maybe Kate, love your thoughts on this too, but there's also a lot of awareness on when it comes to pigment, on toxicity, safety. What can an artist use in the long term that's safe for their own health and well-being if they don't have the best aerated studio? But yeah, curious in your thoughts on that too, Kate. I think artists are always wanting to experiment and push and use what's at hand, and
Yeah.
Contemporary artists, so across the board, there's artists who are working in many different ways.
Yes. Well, there's the reuse and recycle of things that I, for instance, have a trap underneath my sink that gets full of rather nasty sludge, which is a mixture of clay and glaze. And I always dredge it out and sieve it with a peg on my nose because it normally somehow smells of fish. I don't know. And it's called mystery glaze, and it actually does very interesting things. But being rather serious, yes, things are toxic. I mean, the word potty comes from lead poisoning. In Roman times when people drank beer instead of water because beer was cleaner than water and safer to drink for your health, but the beer diluted the lead and everybody went mad as a hatter. It was the mercury in the hats, but it was the lead in the glaze. And you can get the most amazing greens and honeys using lead monosilicate, which I won't buy. I won't have it in the studio. And I think I probably have in store some chrome. I don't touch chrome, for instance. And yes, we're becoming more aware. And I think definitely it depends whether your enthusiasm for a palette of pigment is greater than your worries about health and safety. And I have a team of other people working in my studio, so I'm very health and safety aware, and really I have a machine that cleans the air in the studio and various things. So I am very cautious, and I do not use certain things that I'd like to use because of their toxicity. And we're just touching now on the ethics of mining. I visited a manganese mine in India on a motorbike, and I couldn't believe how people were living in this manganese mine and how their lives were colored with gray manganese, which is not very good. It's linked with Parkinson's disease. So absolutely, I think it's our responsibility to become more aware, especially as shared studios are a big thing now these days. Ceramics is the new yoga, and there's lots of amazing shared facilities opening in many towns. It's extraordinary, the growth of it. And then for that reason, we have to be more careful. I think potters worked in isolation before, and it was a personal choice, but now it's a communal and community choice.
So on that rather Earth Day note, I'm afraid we have to stop, because we could go on forever and ever. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all panelists, to thank Corrie, Kate, and Larry for a really, really vibrant conversation suitable for pigment. So thank you all very much indeed.